Devane paced back and forth across the floor of the dining room, waiting for the princess to join him. Rachel would join him that evening to give her answer about his proposal. It seemed like an eternity before the sound of Rachel's footsteps falling gently on the smooth stone floor approached with decisive courage. Running a hand back through his smooth black hair and straightening his waist jacket, the Dark Lord positioned himself beside his chair with a dignified stance as she appeared in the doorway. He moved from beside his chair he was leaned against and drifted toward her, putting out his hand to gently take her arm as he showed her to her seat. She was seated on his right side, as before, but instead of Salvador serving them, Devane poured their glasses. Rachel saw Devane's lip curl up slightly in a faint grin, and she tilted her head as if to ask what he was smiling about. But he did not answer. Instead, he finished pouring their glasses full of the juice of the cavern fruits. She was pleased that he had prepared this for her again, and he could see by the dark stains on her hands that she had become fond of the fruit. With a twinge of a smile, he opened a nearby dish to reveal a basin of fresh venison. Rachel recognized the meal, and the smell transported her back to the grand banquets her father held in the castle of Kennedac many years ago. In those days, Kennedac was a joyous and safe place to live. With these thoughts, she remembered what they had come to discuss: Devane's proposition. He had offered to rebuild her fallen kingdom and protect her people. He would use his power over the Dark Realm to defend them, and he had promised to be a kind and caring ruler. In return, he had asked that Rachel, Princess of Kennedac, accept his hand in marriage, making Devane her king. She had stopped eating, sensing that the topic of his proposal was being recalled in both of their minds. Her head was lowered slightly as she stared across the room distantly, as if still unsure if she was ready to present her answer to him. But Devane, who was in a gentle spirit, reached his hand and tucked a loose strand of her hair from her braid behind her ear. Her eyes lifted to meet his in wonder. The gesture was so simple, but she was amazed by it. Before all of this, she would have never thought that the Dark Lord could have been capable of such gentleness. She had always pictured him as a wretched, deformed creature, or some horrible demon with claws. But although his eyes were black as midnight, and his form was mighty and threatening, he was so incredibly human. And she watched as his hand drew back slowly from tucking her hair behind her ear, and she stared at it for a moment. A powerful-looking hand, but otherwise normal. No claws or talons, no scales or dragon skin, just flesh and bone. The King of Darkness, Lord of Exiles, was human. Rachel looked into the depths of the ominous man's dark eyes from where she sat, and Devane stared back with curiosity. He had always been able to interpret people's thoughts by looking into their eyes, but with Rachel, he struggled to make sense of her. "Tell me what you are thinking about," he finally said softly as he tilted his head. She bit the corner of her lip as she shrugged slightly, too nervous to bring the subject up. But he wanted to hear it, so he asked, "Do you have an answer for me?" She lifted her head as he asked this, her nervousness beyond concealing. Rachel slowly nodded. "I do have an answer, but it comes with a condition." "Go on," he said in a voice laced with uncertainty. Rachel rose from her chair and turned timidly away from him as she drifted toward the center of the room, not going anywhere, but trying to prevent him from seeing her nervousness. She conjured up her most courageous voice and continued with her back toward him. "If you are going to be my king, I need to know that you will care for my people, no matter what. There will be many who will not approve of our union. Prove yourself to them by being a good and noble ruler." And as she finished, she turned about to face him, and he regarded her with stern genuineness as he said, "I shall rule your people as justly as I rule my own. Your kingdom's name shall be feared among your enemies. I will make your armies powerful, and your city will be strong. Your people's suffering shall soon come to an end. You have my word. I shall be the greatest king your land has ever known. And now, what about you?" he began, also rising from his chair and approaching her with slow, regal movements as he asked, "Will you welcome my people, the ones you call the exiles?" "I will," she said gently, "if you will vow to never hold what my ancestors did to them against us. Let the past be forgotten, so we may live in peace." Devane was silent for a moment before he asked, "And what about me? All that you have been told, everything you have been taught by your scribes and your tutors. You know what I am. You know what they have told you about me. But do you believe them? Or do you trust what I have told you, of our innocence, of the injustice done to us? Can you forsake the lies you have been fed? Will you listen to the voice of a suffering people? Tell me, princess, who do you believe?" I believe you," she said softly, feeling doubt surge in her mind. "Do you? And are you willing to become my wife, my queen, for your people?" Rachel took a deep breath and nodded her head bravely. "Then this is what I ask. I will not deceive myself. I have obvious reason to doubt that you would so willingly marry me. So let there be no doubt in my mind of your commitment. What I ask is very little. I ask for reassurance, to show me that you are able to overcome your fear and resentment of me to become my wife. A kiss, just one kiss, and I shall know that you are sincere." His eyes drilled into hers as he waited for her response. She gazed at him silently, shock and hesitation crippling her. But she stood bravely as Devane drifted nearer, drawing closer until the hollow blackness of his eyes seemed like chasms. He gazed down at her triumphantly as she stood in his shadow in the pale glow of the dim light. She could feel each breath that he exhaled fall from his parted lips, the sweet scent of smoke from the fire still on his cloak as his warm breaths grazed her face. With a gentle hand he lifted her chin, trying once more to study her eyes. But his thoughts were lost as his eyes lowered to her smooth lips, which quivered in fear. The warmth of his hand lifting her chin and grazing her unmarked cheek soothed some of her reluctance. A smile played at his lips as Rachel lifted her chin willingly with his touch, and all of the creatures of the surface and even the holy realm all stood still and hushed as the King of Darkness lowered his head to steal the kiss that would bind their agreement for all of eternity. With this kiss, an era of destruction would end, and a new day would dawn over the lands. They would be bound by fate for the rest of time, to rule together over the new Kennedak, their eternal loyalty established with just this one kiss. But the kiss was not to be. Devane's eyes darted up toward the open doorway as a flicker of motion appeared there, and she felt the rumble in his chest as he growled, "What do you want, imbecile?" Rachel turned her head enough to look through the doorway, and she could see one of Devane's men lingering there. The man wrung his hands nervously and approached his master timidly, bowing his head and muttering apologies. "Spit it out! What is it?" Devane demanded, his touch under Rachel's chin turning into a painful grip in his aggravation. The servant stuttered to find the words. He was obviously disturbed about something, and Devane's impatience was only making things worse. The words had been scrambled and confusing to Rachel's ears, but Devane understood well enough. There were intruders in his caverns. Somehow they had found his staircase and had dared to descend. He would enjoy dealing with them, but regretted having to leave Rachel at such a moment. She was glad for it, though. So, when he announced that he was leaving for a bit to find the men who had wandered into the caverns, Rachel could not have been more relieved. She excused herself and retreated to her chamber. With his dagger at his side and his well-trained ears sharp for any sound, Devane stormed into the grand inner chambers of the caverns, sweeping through the passages like a shadow, a wild smile spreading over his lips as he began to hear the footsteps up ahead. It had been years since any of the goddess's men had wandered their way into Rekos. He anticipated each and every turn of the maze of the caverns, and grew giddy as he could hear their low voices whispering to one another. Finally, he turned the corner and saw his visitors up ahead. 2 men, young, but they both wore extravagant crowns atop their heads and silk and fine fabrics about their garb. Devane was confused at this, wondering who these important-looking prowlers could be. The king of Kenedek had vanished over a year ago, and Callister did not have a king. Not yet, anyway. Devane knew of the island of Ghent, and although he had never been there before, he knew that the kingdom had recently crowned a new ruler. But it was not the young man himself which drew his interest, but the weapon he was carrying. Devane stopped in his tracks, struck to the bone with the utmost astonishment, and a cold shiver ran all throughout his body. The 2 men turned around quickly as they heard Devane's boots scuff the stone floor of the tunnel, and they scrambled back as they beheld the figures so closely pursuing. But Devane was paralyzed in his place, his hands shaking violently, and his pale face growing a sickly white as he stared at the gleaming weapon in the older boy's hands. The boy was only a child compared to Devane, but he was clinging to the hilt of an ancient weapon. Devane had seen it many times, mostly in the nightmares which haunted him night after night, but he had watched as that same blade had cut down and slaughtered innocent men and women, wielded by the legendary guardian of the Northern Isles. The tunnel was dim, so the faces of the 2 young men were unrecognizable, but Devane could see the silver battle-axe of the guardian clearly, and both fear and anger ignited inside of him. "Altama?" the King of Darkness called out in a shaking voice. Marcus approached cautiously and answered, "I am not Altama, but I am of his bloodline. I am King Marcus. I have taken his place as the guardian of the Northern Isles. But who are you? Identify yourself. Are you the one called Devane?" Devane stuttered, convulsing with anger to hear his name spoken from such insignificant lips, along with the order to identify himself. But he contained his rage for the time being. "I am the Lord of Darkness, King of Rekos, and the ruler of exiles. I demand that you lay down your weapon in respect of my dominion," he said, a bead of sweat running down the side of his face. The weapon forged by the light of the heavens for the sole purpose of destroying him, the one blade that could cut through his immortal flesh, was here in Rekos. He could barely contain the feelings inside of him, though he wasn't exactly sure what he was feeling. Was it fear, exhilaration, anger? He could not say. Possibly all of them. But whatever it was whirling around inside of his head, and it made him shake violently to try to control it. Marcus shook his head at the Dark Lord's demand. "I'm sorry, but I lay down my weapon for no one. We've come for Princess Rachel. I trust that she is safe." Anger began to take control as the strongest emotion, thrashing to break free from Devane's control. No man had dared to defy an order from him in decades. But he silenced his thoughts, keeping his eyes on the gleaming weapon in the insolent young man's secure grip. The boy carried it with dignity, though probably not having the faintest idea that he was brandishing the only weapon in existence that could slay the King of Darkness. But Marcus sensed Devane's fear, and although he did not understand why, he knew that something was making the Dark Lord uneasy. "If you will not surrender your weapon to me, then at least set it down against the stone beside you, so that I may approach peacefully and greet my visitors. You are, after all, in my realm. It would be wise to show some respect," Devane warned. But instead, Marcus extended his arm out and swung the axe in front of him, a silent defiance of the order. "Are you challenging me?" Devane scoffed, licking his lips nervously as the blade swept the air between them. Devane stood his ground as Marcus challenged him, and Atticus, standing namelessly beside his friend before the Dark Lord, crept back as he saw a bout developing. But the battle-axe was heavy and slow. It could not compare to the swiftness of the skilled hunter. Despite his overwhelming fear and rage, Devane's hands moved by instinct to his side where he drew his dagger. He balanced the blade on his hand for a moment, and he eyed his target. And before Marcus understood what was happening, the Dark Lord slung the blade from his hand, and it struck with remarkable accuracy. The dagger lodged itself into Marcus's forearm with a sickening sound. Bellowing a cry of sudden agony, the battle-axe clattered to the ground as Marcus clung to his arm, where the hilt of the blade stuck out. With reflexes like a forest cat, Devane lunged for the silver weapon on the ground. But Atticus stepped between the Dark Lord and the battle-axe, drawing his sword and stabbing it down at the King of Darkness. But he was awestruck as the blade of his sword met with Devane's unprotected shoulder, and then recoiled back, juddering as though it had struck against a boulder. Devane glanced up with amusement glowing in his eyes as Atticus stared at him in confusion, swinging the sword again and watching it rebound off of the Dark Lord's arm as he swept up the silver battle-axe. "What magic is this?" Atticus muttered as he stared down at the sharp edge of his sword, wondering why it had not even grazed the man's skin. "No magic," Devane said lowly. "Your mortal weapons are useless against me. I brandish the same force which plunges the world into darkness every nightfall. Not even the goddess herself can hold back the night. Its power dwells within me and fortifies this flesh, and no mere iron or steel can cut through the darkness." And with that, taking up the silver battle-axe in his hand, Devane vanished back through the caverns. Atticus turned his eyes to his friend, who was gripping his bleeding arm above where the blade stuck out. The young Prince of Callister flung off his regal cloak and rent it down the middle, then once more, using the strips as bandages to tie off his friend's arm to stop the bleeding. The pain reminded him of when Salvador had fled Callister, the night they had destroyed the portraits of Justine, and Salvador had used his carving blade to attack Marcus in an attempt to escape. He had suffered a similar injury, but something was different this time, and it was only when he recalled the poison-laced blade given to Atticus at the festival that he realized what was wrong. In a fierce tug, Marcus ripped the dagger out of his shoulder, and the blood started escaping from the wound again. Marcus could see the gleam in the blade, which was slick with poison. The Dark Lord would have nothing to fear by carrying around the poisoned dagger with him, since the blade could not cut his mortal skin. But to one such as Marcus, the injury could prove fatal. The poison had been slow to affect Atticus, since it had entered through the skin, but the deadly gloss from the blade was already pumping through Marcus's blood, and would eventually reach his heart if not stopped. Which is why he used the blade to cut away the fresh bandage which Atticus had tied about his arm. The wound gushed freely now, and Atticus looked horrified to watch. "What are you doing? Are you mad?" Unable to speak, Marcus held out the Dark Lord's dagger in a shaky hand, and Atticus spied the gleam on the blade, realizing the graveness of the situation. Marcus was spilling his blood intentionally, trying to drain the poison out before it was too late. But losing so much blood could kill Marcus. There was too much risk. Atticus tried to rebandage his friend's arm, but Marcus pushed him away, demanding that Atticus let him continue. And the two sat quietly, nervous and ill, praying to the goddess that Marcus would be spared. But a far worse fate was already unfolding as the King of Darkness fled away with the silver battle-axe, the weapon of heavenly light, forged by the goddess's own hand and containing a great portion of her power. In Devane's clutches, the authority she had imparted into the blade would be his to command. And as this fragment of divine power fused itself with his own supreme authority over the dark realm, he wondered for the first time if maybe he had been wrong. Perhaps the darkness can consume the light.